Hello friends, welcome to my YouTube channel, The Current Affairs Audiobooks. This channel has been created to provide updated info about various current affairs issues. So if you like the content, please do like, share and subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to hit the bell icon to notify you when I post new content. Hello friends, today we'll have a look at the Russia-Ukraine war with a brief look into the background of the events leading to the conflict, the Russian demands, the current state of the conflict, the impact on various nations and regions and their economies, and most importantly, the military lessons learned from the war. So please make sure you listen till the very end. Let's get rolling. Coming on to the background. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. After the fall of the Soviet Union, 15 republics became independent. The Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, was formed to replace the Soviet Union. Currently, 9 former Soviet republics are members of the CIS. Ukraine was one of the founding members of the CIS, but it did not ratify the charter. The Collective Security Treaty Organization was formed by Russia with former Soviet republics Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine occurred in November 2004. This was followed by the color revolutions in various countries. Georgia and Ukraine were seen as trendsetters of the Velvet Revolutions in the CIS. Russia accused the West of meddling in the former Soviet states with an aim to contain Russia and build spheres of influence in Russia's neighborhood. Russia warned the West and accused it of orchestrating street demonstrations in Ukraine and claimed that it was following double standards in international politics. In March 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. The US and the European Union imposed sanctions on Russia. The Ukrainian parliament voted in favor of opting for NATO membership in December 2014. Russia described the move by the Ukrainian parliament to opt for NATO as confrontationalist. Russia is opposed to the eastward expansion of NATO. Russia mobilized troops around Ukraine from October 2021, and by Feb 2022 it had mobilized more than 1 lakh troops on the three sides of Ukraine. What are Russia's demands? Russia has demanded legal guarantees that NATO will not expand eastwards. It has called for a ban on further expansion of NATO to include Ukraine and Georgia or other nations in Russia's neighborhood. Russia has asked that NATO should roll back its military deployment to the 1990s level and ban the deployment of IRBMs in areas that would allow NATO to reach Russia. Russia has also asked NATO to curb its military cooperation with Ukraine and other former Soviet republics. Russia and NATO should limit the deployment of missiles, set up emergency telephone hotlines, and also work to prevent incidents in the Baltics and the Black Sea. The NATO allies warned Russia that they would not compromise on the alliance's right to defend its eastern members to avoid further conflict. It would be impossible for the 30 NATO members to agree to Russia's core demands for a new security order in Europe, and Russia should have no veto on Ukraine's right to eventually join the alliance. The Russian president declared that he had ordered a special military operation to protect people, including Russian citizens, who had been subjected to genocide in Ukraine. He declared that the offensive was meant to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. The NATO ordered its military commanders to activate preparations to defend Allied territory after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The US president held Russia responsible for the consequences of the Ukraine invasions. The US and allies imposed sanctions on Russia. The sanctions include blocking Russian banks from the global financial system, halting technology exports, and directly targeting the Russian president. The measures include imposing restrictions on Russia's central bank's ability to access and deploy the $630 billion in foreign exchange reserves. These measures were meant to block Russia's ability to support the ruble as its value plunged. The economic sanctions also included blocking Russia's banks from SWIFT financial messaging system used to validate and complete international payment transactions. The sanctions would also target Russia's import of sensitive technology in the defense, aviation, and maritime sectors. On 2nd March 2022, the US imposed sanctions on Belarus to help prevent the diversion of items, including technology and software, in the defense sectors to Russia through Belarus. The US would ban the import of all Russian oil, gas, and energy. Bans were placed over the airspace, which would prohibit flights into or over the European Union by every Russian plane. Russia's media outlets were also banned by the European Union. The International Olympic Committee's executive board recommended banning Russian and Belarusian athletes and officials from international events. They also decided to withdraw the Olympic Order, which is the highest honor granted by the IOC, from all persons who currently have an important function in the government of the Russian Federation, including the president. Russia was also expelled from the 2022 FIFA World Cup and its teams were suspended from all international football competitions. In retaliation, Russia said it was closing its airspace to flights from Bulgaria, Poland, and the Czech Republic. On 10th March, Russia banned exports of important items as well as forestry products until the end of 2022 in retaliation to sanctions by the West. The impact on Russian economy and financial markets was seen with the ruble falling by 30% to an all-time low against the dollar. The Russian central bank was also forced to more than double its interest rate to 20%, which is the highest in 2 decades, and impose control on capital flows. The sanctions were designed to have maximum long-term impact on Russia while minimizing the impact on the US and its allies. The total potential of the economic sanctions would amount to the toughest levied on a nation in modern times. Let us have a look at the current state of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. In late March 2022, Russia announced that it would reduce military activity near Kyiv and Chernihiv. As the initial Russian invasion slowed, long-range missile strikes caused significant damage to Ukrainian military assets, urban residential areas, and communication and transportation. On 18th April, Russia launched a major offensive in eastern Ukraine following its failed attempt to seize Kyiv. Russia is likely to announce a new phase in this war against Ukraine on 9th of May, which is a national holiday known as Victory Day because it marks the anniversary of the end of the World War II campaign in Europe. The fighting has caused nearly 3,000 civilian deaths and internally displaced more than 7 million people. The conflict has forced another 5 million Ukrainians to flee to neighboring countries. Russia's defense ministry claimed that 771 Ukrainian fighters from the Azovstal steel works in Mariupol had surrendered, taking the total to 1730. The ministry also claimed that 80 of the fighters were wounded. The Russian authorities claimed that they planned to destroy Azovstal after capturing it and turn Mariupol into a resort city. Ukraine seems determined to reclaim control over the southern cities of Kherson, Melitopol, Berdyansk, Ernubdar, and Mariupol, currently occupied by Russian troops. Ukraine's fighters blew up an armored train carrying Russian troops. Russia has fired more than 2,000 missiles in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion began. Russia said that it will start using a new generation of powerful lasers in Ukraine to destroy drones. The Ukrainian president mocked Russia's wonder weapons and said that it clearly shows the complete failure of the mission. Ukraine's Human Rights Commission claimed that at least 231 children have died and 427 were injured since the beginning of the offensive. It also claimed that Russia has been carrying out apparent war crimes, including executions, torture, and other abuses. With Russian forces making slow progress in Ukraine, some analysts believe Putin will threaten military escalation and call for mass mobilization. Others envision formal annexation of Ukrainian territory and a declaration of victory with scaled down aims. Speculations are also rife of Kremlin aiming at the disintegration of Ukraine into several states. On the diplomatic front, the US reopened its embassy in Kiev after nearly 3 months of closing it down and withdrawing diplomats shortly before the invasion began. Ukraine does not intend to compromise with Russia and will not give up any territory. Russia expelled 85 diplomats and staff from the embassies of France, Italy, and Spain in retaliation for the expulsion of Russian diplomats. Other countries may be dragged directly into the war if it continues affecting states bordering Russia. On the economic front, Russian authorities claimed that the US did not have any legal authority to seize Russian central bank assets which were frozen due to the invasion. Some European Union officials were advocating seizing about $300 billion in Russian central bank foreign currency assets frozen by sanctions to pay for Ukraine's reconstruction. The US, several global development banks, and other groups revealed a multi-billion-dollar plan to address a worldwide food security crisis amid Russia's war in Ukraine. Coming on to aid, the US announced $215 million in emergency food assistance for Ukraine. Japan announced doubling of aid to Ukraine to the tune of $600 million. Australia increased its contribution to Kiev's war effort to more than 285 million Australian dollars. The World Bank said that it will make $30 billion available to help stem the food security crisis triggered by Russia's war in Ukraine. The European Commission will provide Ukraine with a €9 billion macro financial aid and recovery program. What is India's stand with respect to the conflict? India appealed for an immediate ceasefire and a return to dialogue and discussed safe evacuation of Indians from the conflict areas. Thereby, it launched Op Ganga to bring back citizens stranded in Ukraine. India abstained from voting in the resolution against Russia at the UN Security Council meeting, at UN General Assembly, and at the UN Human Rights Council. What was China's stand? China criticized NATO and called for a balanced, effective, and sustained European security mechanism which completely abandons the Cold War mentality. It expressed its support for Russia by calling for Europe to address the legitimate security concerns of all countries. It called for a diplomatic resolution of the conflict but did not criticize Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It abstained from voting on the UN Security Council resolutions against Russia. Let us have a look at the implications of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. What are the implications for India? India has maintained its strategic autonomy by abstaining from the UN Security Council resolutions against Russia and providing an explanation of its vote in a balanced manner. India's stand on the conflict does not reflect any pressure from Russia, and it underlines its position to safeguard its own interests. India needs to adopt a calibrated approach at a time of the weakening of the US led global order and a rising China. India needs a strategic partnership with Russia to balance the geopolitical uncertainties in the region. The sanctions on Russia, unleashed by the US and its allies, will have implications for India's defense cooperation with Russia. A long-term conflict between Russia and Ukraine could lead to the strengthening of Russia-China relations, which would have negative implications for India. Sanctions may also be applied on India for acquisition of the S-400 missile system from Russia, which would otherwise apply under the Countering America's Adversaries through Sanctions Act, also known as CAA-TSA. Most observers feel that wider sanctions is likely for three reasons. India is banking on the fact that the US recognizes India's security imperatives vis-a-vis China, which is a shared concern which requires it to engage with Russia, which has been a long-standing defense partner. The sanctions will set back Indo-US ties by conveying a message that US is not reliable and strengthen the skeptics within the Indian system who have viewed deepening ties with caution. It will potentially reverse the deepening defense engagement between India and the US with implication for the US defense industry. It may enhance India's dependence on Russia even as India has sought to diversify its defense relationships in recent years. This will also create problems for the US, which has invested in India in the past 3 decades. Let us have a look at the impact on the Indo Pacific. Renewed tensions with Russia will lead to the shift in focus for the US national security establishment with two implications. Firstly, planning for the Indo Pacific does not match concrete actions on ground. The US's engagement and investment in the Indo Pacific is still relatively modest. There is a big deficit in terms of the military investments in the Indo Pacific strategy. The regional economies are still deeply integrated with China in trade. A military crisis with Russia can end up weakening the US's capacity in the Indo Pacific and lead to greater resource allocation in Europe. If India feels compelled to be mildly sympathetic to Russia or even excessively neutral, it will not find a receptive audience for its position in the US. What are the implications for China? The Russia Ukraine conflict would indirectly benefit China. The conflict has also provided China an opportunity to play on Russia's insecurities while still pursuing its aggressive policy in Asia. The changing security order in Europe and the world will be of benefit to China. The conflict has created a situation where the focus of the US and its allies could shift from the Indo Pacific to Russia, thereby benefiting China. Let us have a look at the implications for the Indian economy. The conflict has caused global crude oil prices soaring past $100 per barrel. This is a major concern for India as high fuel prices will have an impact on the inflation and may disturb the union budget targets, which hinge on an average price of $75 per barrel. The Russia Ukraine conflict could increase India's import bills beyond the 600 billion mark this fiscal, as India's dependence on crude oil, natural gas, gems, and jewelry and other fertilizers increases. This could increase the inflation, creating a wider current account deficit and a falling rupee. India's $10 billion bilateral trade with Russia and around $2.5 billion with Ukraine is at risk. What are the implications for the global economy? A sharp increase in energy and commodity prices have increased the inflationary hike witnessed by the global economy as it recovers from the pandemic. The IMF pointed out that the scarcity and supply disruptions could be more for countries with close economic ties with Russia and Ukraine. Let us now have a look at the lessons learned at the strategic level. A number of lessons have been learned. The first and foremost of them is the relevance of conventional warfare. The reduced likelihood of a direct war between great powers and the eruption of several irregular wars in recent decades has projected the illusion that conventional interstate conflict is obsolete. Such belief is out of touch with reality. Hard power still remains an asset that nation states can resort to against their counterparts in order to pursue their interests. Emerging modes of trade. Countries have been relying on fintech platforms, cryptocurrencies, and digital assets in order to fund the purchase of military hardware as well as bypass sanctions imposed by various economies. Russia has passed an ultimatum to stop the flow of natural gas to European consumer markets unless payments are carried out in rubles, which shows the growing complexity of emerging geo-economic trends. Coming on to the global balance of power. The Ukrainian war also illustrates the idea of a global, rule based order as a system that can guarantee international governance and regulate states' behavior is based on inaccurate assumptions. Such conflicts can have unintended consequences. An occupation and a parallel protracted counterinsurgency campaign against rebels, backed by intelligence, weaponry, cash, and logistical support provided by NATO, have the potential to badly damage Russian national power. Direct engagement by other states could literally trigger a nuclear exchange. The economic disruptions unleashed by rising energy prices can generate political unrest and create pressure to reassess the strategic pertinence of sanctions against Russia. The presence of unconventional fighters like mercenaries, foreign volunteers, special forces, and paramilitary squads adds another layer of complexity. Fighters belonging to the Azov regiment, the Chechen Kadyrovites, and the Wagner group certainly challenge traditional concepts of soldiering. The importance of information warfare and psychological warfare gain prominence. The massive reach of digital technologies and platforms like social media exponentially increase the circulation of propaganda in order to shape perceptions, trigger strong emotional reactions, generate supportive attitudes amongst both local and foreign audiences, and advance convenient narratives. Movement of troops and weapon platforms, military actions, and even propaganda can be quickly transmitted. Russia's inability to disrupt internet communications in Ukraine has resulted in an information domination by the West. In future conflicts, it will be difficult to completely suppress internet and social media. Therefore, tactical forces need to reorient and train themselves in fighting in a transparent domain. For India, we not only need to improve our information warfare capabilities, but there is also a need to enhance reliance on indigenous systems and India based servers and routers. The impact of nationalism. The pro Western orientation of Ukrainian foreign policy and the impact of the Russian aggression has reinforced the resolve amongst Ukrainians to disregard their differences and bitter internal rivalries in order to resist together. On the Russian side, the increasing ostracism and the prospect of imminent economic hardships has not demoralized the Russian people. In fact, the imposition of sanctions designed to bring down Russia as a national state have encouraged widespread popular revanchism and resentment. A major reason for the campaign being unsuccessful was the Russian expectation that Russian speaking people in Ukraine would rise up in revolt. That did not happen, pretty much like it did not happen in Operation Gibraltar, launched by Pakistan in 1965, when they expected Kashmiris to rise in revolt against India. The Ukrainians dug down to defend their country with a steely resolve, whereas Russian soldiers had come in initially as a peacekeeping force, disseminating their plans only on a need to know basis. A determined defender can effectively hold up a larger force for longer durations as it requires clearing the town house by house, street by street. The military aid from the West has included helping Ukrainian soldiers improve their tactical fighting abilities. They have been achieving success and have been able to deny Russia their initial objectives in this war. Coming on to the importance of modern technology. This is probably the first time in which weaponized vectors of coercion and disruption have been used on such a massive scale. The US has dispatched hundreds of millions of dollars worth of military aid into Ukraine, including anti tank and anti aircraft weapons, With enough weapons, a defender can keep a much larger enemy force at bay. The poor situational awareness and Russian military casualties were some of the reasons for Russia's slow progress in the initial stages. Among the many potential explanations, the Russian BTGs lacked intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets such as light drones, and their assets couldn't keep up with the maneuver elements. Lack of use of drones has highlighted a key vulnerability in Russia's military operation. For India, future wars will be fought by indigenous weapons and equipment, and hence it is essential to be self reliant. Atmanirbharta in defense requirements is the need of the hour. Several initiatives in the recent past, such as reserving 68% of the capital budget for domestic sector and allocating 25% of the R&D budget for private players, in addition to the corporatization of ordnance factories and other initiatives, are steps in the right direction. Requirement of reorganization. The attacking force could use a combined arms maneuver strategy. Any future wars would require greater integration for all arms maneuver, and joint ops and theaterization as envisaged will be the road to success in future ops. Reorganizing the defense structures to have a directive style of command seems to be very pertinent. Ukraine has developed a non commissioned officer corps considered to be the backbone of the military, who have extensive education and are empowered to lead soldiers. Russia has not made a commitment in this sector and instead has a very centralized system and strict authority in passage of orders. Numerically, Russia has applied a force of about 100 BTGs, approximately 2 lakh personnel, against Ukraine's defense forces with a strength of 2,50,000 personnel. The force levels are nearly matching, whereas an offensive should have weight at least 3 times more. This probably raises questions whether the Russians spread themselves too thin on the battle space. Let us evaluate the military operations. The operations appear to have commenced amidst a barrage of long range operational fires from Russian air and missile forces engaging high value targets to shape and soften the battle space. The shaping operations were accompanied by a near simultaneous launch of airborne, land, and sea based operations. Russian strategy appears to have been perceived on the fact Russia would be able to capitulate Ukraine with the shock of its firepower at the earliest. When this failed to happen, with a strong West backed Ukrainian resistance, the Russian strategy seems to have dithered. It appears that the appreciation of quick recapitulation of the Ukrainian government and support of the ethnic Russian and Ukrainian population as liberators was faulty. Combined arms war fighting. The inability of the BTGs to operate as a cohesive combined arms team, thereby revealing operational, organizational, and employment flaws, was evident. The Russian BTGs did not have enough troops for encirclement of key objectives and practically had no reserves. The subsidiary tasks, such as defending the flanks or protecting the corridor, were sourced to paramilitary forces and in many cases to conscripts and reservists due to the paucity of prepared combat troops with the BTGs. The Ukrainian army was able to penetrate and ambush the flanks and tail of Russian columns due to ineffective security by the paramilitary or conscripts. Command and control is of great essence in combined arms fighting. It appears that Ukraine, possibly with the help of the West, was able to interfere and disrupt the command and control capabilities of Russia's BTGs. That can partially explain frequent tactical pauses. Therefore, there is a need to cater for redundancies. Air power. Establishment of air superiority, or at least a favorable air situation, is a prerequisite for successful ground operations. Russia could have maintained a high operational tempo of operations by using air power. However, it was claimed that air power was not used to avoid collateral damage to civilian areas. Employment of long range operational fires. Russia appears to have used long range operational fires to compensate for its scarce use of air power and reinforce the usefulness of missiles and rockets in future wars vis-a-vis aerial firepower, which is also costly and losses provide bad optics. The indiscriminate losses to civilian infrastructure due to long range fires seems to be pointing to a limited availability of precision munitions and their selective usage on high value targets by Russia. On the Ukrainian side, the failure to counter Russian long range fires reflects the need for not only a robust missile shield for a defender, but also a capable ballistic missile acquisition system. Coming on to the impact of operational logistics. Russian convoys of military vehicles, largely tanks and BMPs, were seen stranded over a long highway of approximately 45 to 60 kilometers on the northern offensive. Armored tanks, BMPs, and military vehicles were bunched up in the open without even tactical camouflage. This reflects poor standards of tactical training at lower levels. This was probably due to faulty logistics planning, because of which logistics could not reach fighting troops from logistic bases. This again reaffirms the importance of maintaining logistical balance in operations. Importance of air defense. Russia appears to have effectively been able to target Ukrainian ground based static air defense systems with ballistic and cruise missiles, anti radiation missiles, and land vectors using unguided weapons. However, Ukraine's mobile based air defense system seems to be still active, as it is difficult to locate and destroy mobile based air defense systems. In future warfare, conduct of dedicated suppression or destruction of enemy air defense organization, that is SEAD or DIAD ops, with dedicated platforms for dynamic targeting and identification of friend or foe, gains paramount importance. What is the likely end state of this conflict? Russia's likely military aims might be one or more of the following. Russia might like to have a regime change in Ukraine by having a new Ukrainian government, or at least a politically aligned president. Russia may seek the new government in Ukraine to be militarily neutral and dependent on Russia for its defense, and could possibly also become a CSTO member in the near time frame. It might seek a neutrality guarantee through constitutional amendments. Russia could also seek recognition of independence of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. Russia would like the new government to be economically integrated into the Eurasian Economic Union. Russia would also seek transparent borders between itself and Ukraine. On the other hand, Ukraine, aided by the Western powers, may have two immediate war aims. One, to defeat Russia's invasion, and the second, to liberate all Russian occupied territories, including Crimea and the Donbas region. To conclude, the Russian aim of breaking the political cohesivity of Ukraine through multi domain military operations does not seem to have fully succeeded. The Russian plans of capitulation and submission of the Ukrainian forces within 48 to 72 hours have not borne results. Many key cities have not fallen despite facing high intensity operations. These key cities, which after capture should have facilitated subsequent operations as launchpads, are currently serving as islands of resistance. Long range firepower on civilian and military infrastructure are likely being used to lower the morale of Ukrainian forces and civilian population. Russia is also attempting to reconstitute combat power for a possibly long haul fighting in built up area operations. On the Ukrainian side, the key takeaway has been the stoic resistance and the ability to extend Russia's offensive. Ukrainian forces have been able to enforce caution on the Russian Air Force and have forced the Russian ground forces to slow down and even pause their operational tempo. The widespread damage to Ukrainian towns and cities and a massive refugee trail imply massive rehabilitation efforts in the near future. On the global level, the security order in Europe and the rest of the world would depend on how the West effectively counters the challenge of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The best way forward will be to resolve Russia's security concerns through a dialogue with NATO. India is walking a tightrope, and India will have to weigh its options and be at its diplomatic best to protect its own interests without antagonizing any party. With this, we have come to the end of our discussion on the Russia Ukraine conflict. Please do let me know if you would like to know more about current affairs topics in the comment section. If you like the content, please do like, share, and subscribe to my channel. All the best. Jai Hind.